Tracy grew up surrounded by gorillas and formed a very special bond with one of them. But when they were taken away, she assumed they would completely forget her. People also warned her not to try reconnecting after so many years, but she wanted to find out if they still remembered her. Tracy and her father, Damon, felt a strong desire to see the gorillas they had once loved and cared for as children. As they traveled by boat, their excitement grew when they spotted the gorillas foraging near the shore. They had been advised to keep their distance, as these gorillas had now become wild and might not welcome visitors. However, Tracy refused to believe that. She held on to the hope that the gorillas would remember her, just as she missed them deeply. Were they still family? Or had life in the wild changed everything? The gorillas had now formed families of their own, families that had never been in captivity. Tracy and her father were warned that getting too close could be dangerous, but Tracy, as determined as ever, had no intention of holding back. As they traveled down the river, they noticed heads peeking through the dense bushes. The gorillas were watching them intently. Among them, Tracy instantly recognized the gorilla she had raised, even though he had grown and changed over the years. The boat came to a halt, and despite her father's and the guide's cautions, Tracy leaped out. The gorilla, Jarek, who had once been a tiny infant cradled in her arms, now towered over her. Rising onto his back legs, he moved directly toward Tracy. At that moment, nothing and no one could hold him back. If anything were to happen, Tracy was completely alone. As Jarek came nearer, he suddenly reached out and seized Tracy by the arm. Her father instinctively wanted to intervene, but he held back, fearing that any abrupt movement might make the situation worse. Was this how it would end? Tracy, who had devoted her life to loving gorillas, now faced the possibility that one of them might harm her. She couldn't believe her childhood companion would ever turn on her, yet his powerful grip felt menacing. Could it be that their bond was truly broken? The unique connection between Tracy and Jarek began because of her father Damon's dedication to protecting wildlife. To fulfill his mission, he established the Tracy Aspen Foundation, a venture aimed at rescuing animals, especially gorillas, and, when possible, reintroducing them to the wild. Additionally, the family managed Howlett's Zoo in Canterbury, where animals unable to return to their natural habitats found a safe, lifelong home. Growing up in this environment was a magical experience for Tracy and her siblings, as they spent their early years forming close, meaningful connections with the animals around them. Tracy was just over a year old when a young gorilla named Bimmy arrived at the zoo. Tragically, Bimmy had been injured, and his family had been killed by poachers, leaving him alone and in need of care. Damon and his team stepped in to provide the attention he required. Soon, Tracy and her siblings were constantly around Bimmy, who quickly became like a playmate to them. As Tracy got older, she would often play in the gorilla enclosure, making sure Bimmy never felt lonely. Having a gorilla as a friend brought endless joy and excitement to her childhood, creating memories that would last a lifetime. Little did they know, things were about to become even more exciting. One day when Damon picked Tracy up from school, he told her there was a special surprise waiting at home. The surprise was indeed huge, literally. It was a young gorilla named Jarek, an orphan who had lost his mother and would not survive alone in the wild. He was still small and helpless, in need of nurturing and constant care. Since gorillas thrive in close family environments, keeping Jarek in a zoo enclosure was out of the question. He needed a family-like bond, someone to feed him and provide affection, and Tracy was now old enough to help. Tracy took her role seriously, ensuring that Jarek ate well and holding him close whenever he felt frightened. She was a crucial part of his upbringing, but it quickly became apparent that her unique little brother would grow far faster than any human sibling. Before long, Jarek had outgrown their home. After all, gorillas aren't exactly suited to living indoors. It was time for him to move to the zoo, where he would still be cared for, but would have a space more fitting for his size and needs. It was time for Jarek to transition to the zoo. His family didn't want him to be alone, and thankfully, he wouldn't be. Another gorilla, Bimmy, was ready to welcome him into the enclosure. However, caution was essential. Bimmy was significantly larger than Jarek, and if he didn't take to his new companion, he could unintentionally harm the younger gorilla. To introduce them safely, the two were initially allowed to see each other through a gate. Gently, they reached out, touching faces and attempting to play. To everyone's surprise, Bimmy was incredibly gentle, and soon the caregivers were confident in allowing them to interact freely. The introduction went as smoothly as they could have hoped. Jarek and Bimmy quickly became inseparable friends. They still adored Tracy, and soon she was able to join them in their play sessions once more. There was never any jealousy between the gorillas, only warmth and affection, which they showed abundantly toward Tracy. Convincing the public that Tracy's friendship with the gorillas was safe proved to be challenging. She was used to freely entering the enclosure and spending time with Jarek and Bimmy as often as she pleased, never considering the need to change her routine. When a photography team visited the zoo, they likely assumed that showcasing her unique bond with the gorillas would be widely appreciated. However, the public's response was anything but positive. Outrage ensued, as many felt that allowing Tracy, or any child, to interact with gorillas without strict safety protocols was irresponsible. The backlash was so intense that the zoo received an official warning. If they didn't adopt safety measures, they faced the possibility of being shut down. In an instant, Tracy was forbidden from physical contact with two of her closest friends. Now she could only visit them through the glass of their enclosure. Although she was old enough to understand that the decision didn't come from her father, she was still too young to fully grasp the safety concerns driving it. The gorillas, meanwhile, were equally confused and saddened, unable to understand why they couldn't play with their beloved friend. The separation was painful for both sides, leaving Tracy and the gorillas longing for the closeness they had once shared. Each day, Tracy came straight to the zoo after school. She would sit by the glass, and as soon as Jarek and Bimmy saw her, they would eagerly rush over, only to be stopped by the barrier between them. Jarek would let out soft, sorrowful sounds, and Tracy would place her hand against the glass. Jarek would mirror her, pressing his hand on the same spot, both of them longing for a touch that was no longer possible. Although safety was one reason for limiting her visits, there was another critical purpose. It was time to prepare the gorillas for life in the wild. Now, strong and mature, they were ready to return to their natural habitat and needed to adapt to life among other gorillas without human companionship. From that point on, human interaction was gradually reduced. Though Jarek and Bimmy had been gentle in the zoo, they would need to build resilience to thrive in the wilderness. Over the next few months, Darian and his team completed the gorillas' final training, ensuring they had the skills to survive in the jungle. This step fulfilled the very mission of the Foundation: to rescue, rehabilitate, and ultimately release animals back to their rightful home in the wild. Despite Tracy's feelings, it took only a few months until Jarek and Bimmy were finally ready to begin their journey back home to Gabon. A sanctuary had been secured where they would not only be safe, but also have the freedom to roam as they pleased. For Tracy and her family, this was a bittersweet farewell, one that meant they wouldn't see the gorillas for a long time, if ever again. Before they were given a mild sedative to keep them calm, Tracy had the chance to hold both Jarek and Bimmy close, savoring the last hug she'd share with them. The gorillas leaned into her, pressing their heads against hers, clinging to the moment just as she was. It was a unique bond, a deep connection between a girl and the animal she'd grown up with, one that would now span continents. Tracy watched as the gorillas were carefully placed into crates and loaded onto a truck, taking their first step toward Africa. This moment embodied everything the family had worked for: their shared goal of seeing Jarek and Bimmy live free in their natural home. Yet, for Tracy, the experience was as heart-wrenching as it was fulfilling. It felt as though she was bidding farewell to family members, uncertain if she'd ever have the chance to see them again. Years passed, and Daman made a trip to Africa to check on the gorillas. The news was wonderful. Jarek and Bimmy were thriving. They had joined a family group and were living as nature intended, surrounded by their own kind. Seeing them in the wild, fully integrated with other gorillas, reassured everyone that all the hard work, and even the difficult farewell, had been worthwhile. The gorillas were finally home in Africa, but they had not been forgotten. Tracy, in particular, often thought of her childhood companions. Over a decade had passed since their return to Africa, and in that time Jarek and Bimmy had fully embraced their wild nature. They had become wary of humans and no longer showed any interest in interacting with people. Tracy was advised never to try visiting them, as they would likely no longer recognize her. Despite this, Tracy held on to memories of their bond, accepting that they were where they truly belonged. As Tracy grew older, she began working with the foundation, following in her father's footsteps by helping to rescue countless animals. But when Daman faced a health scare, their lives took a sudden turn. Once he recovered, he started planning a trip to Africa, determined to revisit his favorite place. This time, they would also attempt to locate Jarek, Bimmy, and their families. The journey was long, and not one that would be easy for someone in his condition, so Daman felt the timing was crucial if he wanted to see the gorillas one last time. When Tracy learned of her father's plans, she was determined to join him. She had to see how Jarek and Bimmy had turned out after all these years. She was eager to know if the gorillas she'd helped raise had flourished in the wild. Her enthusiasm wasn't shared by others, though. Many advised her against going, warning that nearly 20 years had passed, and the gorillas had likely changed beyond recognition. They argued that Jarek and Bimmy wouldn't remember her, and meeting them now might shatter her cherished memories. But Tracy couldn't be swayed. She couldn't bear the thought of her father going alone, and she needed to witness their transformation firsthand. Daman, understanding her feelings more than anyone else, agreed. He knew that seeing them in their natural habitat would bring her peace, no matter the outcome. Soon they embarked on their journey. The first leg involved a flight to Gabon, but reaching the forest where the gorillas lived required further effort. Since no roads or airports led to the remote sanctuary, they traveled by off-road vehicle to a base camp where they'd stay for a few days. This setup allowed them multiple attempts to find Jarek's family if they didn't succeed immediately. However, hiking directly into that dense forest wasn't feasible. Instead, they would navigate the river by a small boat. Before setting out in the morning, the sanctuary guides met with them, emphasizing strict rules for the encounter. With serious expressions, the guides explained that approaching the gorillas too quickly could be dangerous. They would watch the gorillas carefully, and only if the animals appeared calm could Tracy and Daman move closer. Under no circumstances were they to touch or interact with the gorillas directly. The guides reminded them that, although the gorillas might have known them long ago, they were now wild creatures. Jarek and Bimmy could no longer be trusted to show the gentleness they once had. They were fully adapted to their natural instincts. On the first day of their search, Tracy and Daman were stunned by what they encountered. As their boat glided along the river, faces began to appear among the trees. The gorillas were watching them. Intrigued, they seemed just as curious about these unexpected visitors as Tracy and Daman were about them. Tracy gasped softly, her heart racing as she recognized the two gorillas she had known so well. They looked different, older and more powerful, but she knew them instantly. Tears welled up as Jarek moved closer, reaching out with his strong hands. She could barely stand as he touched her, her knees shaking not with joy, but with overwhelming emotion and fear. Yet as she gazed into his familiar eyes, She felt certain there was recognition in his gaze. Jarek leaned his head against hers, just as he had done so many years ago. Tracy ran her hand gently over his head, just like she used to when he was a frightened baby. In return, Jarek rubbed her arms softly and pressed his head against her shoulder, silently greeting her once more. Then Bimmy came closer, recognizing her too. Though they had all changed, he clearly knew that the woman before him was the same little girl who had once played by his side. Using one finger, Bimmy gently traced it down her cheek, a tender, familiar gesture. When Damon approached, both apes immediately began to interact with him, embracing him and playfully rolling around. Somehow, they seemed to understand that they could play freely with Damon, while treating Tracy with a careful, respectful gentleness. Eventually, the other members of their gorilla family gathered nearby, observing from the edge of the group. As father and daughter took in the sight of the gorilla's natural home, Jarek and Bimmy seemed to prefer spending their time with the humans who had been their very first family. The guides were astonished. They hadn't expected the gorillas to so quickly display affection for their former human caretakers. The connection was undeniable. Jarek and Bimmy truly missed them. Though they showed joy at seeing Damon, their interactions with Tracy were marked by something deeper. As the time came to return to the boats, the gorillas let out soft, mournful sounds, sensing that they were about to lose their best friend all over again. It was a heartbreaking scene, but at least Tracy had been given another precious day with them. This time, as they said goodbye, she understood that it could be final. There was no guarantee she'd ever return. The gorillas seemed to feel her sadness, hesitant to let her go. Bimmy held her close, gently yet firmly, unwilling to release her. Tears streamed down her face as she slowly pried his arms away. Then she turned to Jarek, the gorilla she had raised from a tiny infant. Her heart swelled with love and sorrow as he lowered his head onto her chest. She bent down, kissed the top of his head, and whispered her love softly. When she finally climbed onto the boat, the gorillas stood together, watching her depart. Tracy felt an overwhelming gratitude for ignoring those who had urged her not to come. This journey had given her an experience she wouldn't trade for anything. The bond she shared with Jarek and Bimmy had withstood both time and distance. They were back where they belonged, and now Tracy knew she had her own purpose: to return home and continue saving more animals in need. Did this story touch your heart? Imagine reconnecting with a wild animal you once knew as a child. Would you take that chance after so many years? Do you believe animals hold memories of their first family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. This is truly a beautiful example of the deep bonds that can form across species. Thank you for joining us on this journey. See you in the next video. Wishing you a wonderful day.